Just how time passes. I think Donovan's presentation really sets out something before I get into how trade agreements are going to, in the future, affect trade between countries, and that is that if you take any 10-year slot period, and you look at what decision makers, corporations, had to contend with, the unpredictability would be the word that has happened over and over again. So you take, when I lived in Vietnam in the 90s to 2000, what was a major catastrophe here was the typhoons that hit central Vietnam. I remember one in 2001. And then you look at the period in the United States between 2001 and 2010, Hurricane Katrina hit, and people thought that was the most catastrophic event that ever hit the U.S. in terms of the Gulf, that New Orleans would disappear, and it's lost a great deal of percentage population. And then you have, 5 years later, Hurricane Sandy, which has eroded the East Coast, and basically the insurance companies keep eroding how much they will cover in terms of insurance. And you look at flood control, which was the way in U.S. insurance was developed, and it's fast disappearing as a sound way you can protect your own. So going into we were sitting last night at dinner and we all thought, if anybody's seen the World War Z, about the zombies, that might be the next 10 years, but not zombies, but a chemical kind of an impact, a biological chemical catastrophe. So the scary part of it is that our decision makers have a difficulty in preparing us for the worst and always try to tell us to look be rosy and so on, so that we're not prepared for what faces us, would be economic or social or environmental. And Vietnam, as a developing country, has succeeded over the last number of years because of trade and the opening up of its markets and producing jobs in technology, in agriculture, in textiles, fishery, mining, and a lot of other areas, that coffee and other natural resources. And what was the leading aspect that opened up Vietnam was its own laws, the enterprise law, but which gave people the power to start their own businesses, but the bilateral trade with materials to Vietnam, because that template was that led Vietnam to WTO with a lot of potential. Neither agreements focused on environmental issues. They were on the side talking about. But we're now facing a period where in the U.S. You could not get a trade agreement passed without dealing with environmental issues. You might not pass if you deal with environmental issues, but at least you really can't present it without at least addressing them. The issue being that overall what will happen in the next 15 years, it won't be because of the Trans-Pacific Agreement that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But significantly, there was a WTO case involving Thailand a number of years ago, which involved the fact that there were goods coming into the U.S. that were cheaper than the price of the goods being made in the U.S. It was pointed out that because of how I think it was a fishery case, how the fish were being exported, the way they were treated and sent, that environmental concerns were not addressed, and therefore the price, the additional tariffs to be put on because there was an advantage to that. So I'm going to rush now because I was just told 1 minute. I need 3 minutes, so I'll be much faster now. I'm sorry. TPP is going to be the largest free trade agreement with approximately 40% of the world's GDP and 1/3 of the total world trade. Vietnam is going to be bringing up 13.6% in increase of Vietnam's GDP. That's the percentage we get. The agreement is important because it involves Vietnam, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. I'm getting it wrong again. I'm really bad at saying Vietnam, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Brunei, Singapore, Canada, Peru, Mexico, Japan. And for Vietnam, U.S. and Japan, and Malaysia, those are really the four most important countries, because all the other countries I mentioned, including New Zealand, already have trade agreements, but free trade agreements. So what is occurring in this agreement is that garment and footwear will be a very important area for Vietnam in terms of reduction of tariffs with the developed countries it trades with. Those will be reduced, and what's called point of origin, where the cotton and other stuff you use from China and other places, there'll be tariffs coming down that by the time the U.S. and Vietnam are the two major partners in there come to an agreement. And the U.S. is the largest importer of textiles from Vietnam. Agricultural products export for Vietnam is forecast to double by TPP. Right now, the president of the U.S. Agricultural products are about 20 billion for the U.S. and 10 billion for Japan. It's expected to increase significantly when the tariffs come off. But now, there were 5 factors that explain Vietnam's important manufacture I went through. The first 3 factors boost Vietnam's exports in terms of trade under TPP. The last 2 amplify these benefits by stimulating productivity growth. Strong trade with the United States, high protection abroad against apparel, footwear, which the Vietnamese principal exports, strong competitive positions in these other manufacturing industries where China comparative advantage is fading. For instance, in Japan, the United States, other countries, people are moving their factories out of China. It used to be that you were China plus, now it's become more that people just are having more and more difficulty trading with China and having their factories there. High initial domestic protection and powerful scale effects in Vietnam's principal production clusters. So what TPP is going to do on the environment, what it's looking to deal with in there, is present an environmental chapter that will include forcible obligations for parties to amend domestic environmental laws and abide by global environmental agreements. These issues include language to address biodiversity, conservation, illegal logging, wildlife, wood, agricultural trade, mining, land use, economic subsidies that lead to overfishing, and illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing more generally. The U.S. position on the table and was tabled at the Chicago negotiating session in September 2011, containing 3 components. The first component is specific new provisions on illegal logging, marine fisheries, and endangered species, as well as obligations to enforce domestic laws and regulations in illegal trade in plants and wildlife. The second component requires the parties to uphold the commitments to any of these multinational environmental agreements they have signed. The third component allows for stakeholder participation to challenge member states' adherence to provisions, including the possibility of binding dispute settlement across disciplines. Subject to provisions of the environmental chapter, the binding dispute settlement has proved controversial among many of the countries who have already signed free trade agreements. And so this will probably be narrowed significantly in the final agreement reached. The environmental chapter in TPP has agreed some environmental standards below take into consideration wood product sector, seafood sector, and garment sector. Now, I want to close by saying that the public will have a lot to say in getting across comments and so on as this agreement moves forward. We're reaching a point now in the agreement where the leaders are going to meet at APEC. There'll be a side meeting in October, beginning of October, where the presidents and prime ministers of the countries who are involved will try to come to a general agreement, pushing from the top down an agreement. And the effort is to try to close a deal by the end of this year. The industry will particularly oppose that because they really try to run what goes into trade agreements, and they will find that that's being pushed down their throats. And the consumer and environmental groups will feel the same way. So there'll be a pushback. But generally, what we would want to get out of TPP from a perspective of adaptation and the future would be the beginning of at least the addressing of these issues, significantly allowing people to have dispute settlements in issues that may come up between country to country. And that will be very difficult because that will be one of the things that, because this will be a first agreement of this sort that's multilateral, that will be, given the history of Kyoto and climate change agreements, even though this is a much smaller group of countries, they're very diversified, and with people like China and Korea now trying to get to PPP, I would give it about a 30 to 50% that will have significant environmental standards in TPP, but will at least be addressed for the first time.